Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My mother had already passed, taking the last remnants of warmth from our home, leaving me alone in a house that felt increasingly like a ledger, waiting to be balanced. I stood in the dim, freezing vestry of St. Jude's stone chapel, listening to the relentless assault of the Pacific Northwest storm against the leaded glass windows. The rain did not fall in delicate drops. It battered the ancient stone like a warning, isolating the church from the rest of the rocky coastline in a wash of gray. In my trembling hands, I held a single sheet of crisp, cream-colored stationery. The handwriting on it was frantic, looping, and undeniably selfish. It was a farewell note. Evelyn Vance, my beautiful, charismatic older sister, was gone. I stared at the heavy wooden table where she had left her parting words. Beside the letter lay her discarded wedding veil. The expensive French lace and dense fabric pooled around me like spilled milk, white, flawless, and entirely meaningless. Evelyn had written that she could not be sold, that she refused to be the collateral used to save our father's failing shipping empire. She had climbed out the narrow vestry window, leaving behind the scent of her sweet jasmine perfume, and a financial catastrophe that would ruin our family by nightfall. The heavy iron handle of the vestry door rattled, breaking the oppressive silence of the small room. Arthur Vance stepped inside, his tailored suit damp from the storm outside, his face pale and drawn. My father's eyes darted around the empty space, landing first on the open window, then on the veil, and finally on the cream-colored paper in my grip. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not ask if Evelyn was safe. He simply read the note, his hand shaking so violently that the paper snapped against his knuckles. When he finally looked up at me, there was no paternal warmth in his gaze. There was only the cold, terrifying calculation of a desperate man staring at the edge of an abyss. "The creditors will take the house by Monday," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his ruin. "They will take the company. They will take your mother's gravesite plot. Julian Sterling does not accept broken contracts, Clara. If there is no bride at the altar today, we are finished." I took a slow step backward, the cold flagstones seeping an icy chill through the thin soles of my shoes. I was a textile restorer. I spent my days in quiet rooms, carefully mending antique lace and preserving fragile threads that the world had forgotten. I was the invisible daughter, the one who worked in the shadows, while Evelyn charmed the high society dining rooms. I was never meant to be the center of a transaction. "I am not Evelyn," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the roaring wind outside. "You are a Vance," the desperate man snapped, stepping forward and closing the distance between us. "Put on the dress, Clara." He did not wait for my consent. Arthur reached into his coat pocket and retrieved my mother's heirloom wedding ring, the very ring Evelyn was supposed to wear. He grabbed my left hand with a bruising grip. I tried to pull away, but he was fueled by pure panic. He forced the heavy gold band onto my ring finger. It was sized for my sister's slender, delicate joints. The metal caught fiercely on my knuckle, scraping the skin raw. I gasped as he pushed it down by force, leaving an angry, blooming red mark in its wake. The ring sat tight and suffocating against my skin, a physical shackle binding me to a debt I did not incur. "Keep your head down. Keep the veil over your face," Arthur instructed, his breathing ragged as he stepped back, refusing to look at the red welt he had just created on my hand. "Sterling barely looked at your sister during the negotiations. He just wants the alliance. By the time he realizes it is you, the vows will be spoken, and the ink will be dry." I looked down at the weighty satin gown hanging on the wooden partition. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum or beg him to reconsider. I knew the absolute finality of our poverty. Without Julian Sterling's money, my mother's ancestral home would be auctioned off, and the quiet sanctuary where I did my restoration work would be demolished. I unbuttoned my modest wool coat, letting it drop to the floor. The silence in the room had teeth gnawing at my pride as I lifted the luxurious yardage and stepped into my sister's abandoned cage. 30 minutes later, the massive oak doors of the chapel groaned open. The sudden rush of cold air carried the heavy scent of burning incense and damp wool from the congregation. The church was packed with the elite of the coastal city, a sea of dark, expensive suits and shadowed faces, waiting to witness a corporate acquisition disguised as a holy sacrament. I stood at the threshold, the heavy lace veil obscuring my vision, casting the world in a hazy, textured white. The dress was slightly too long for me, the rigid corset digging into my ribs, demanding that I hold my breath. At the end of the long stone aisle stood the groom. Julian Sterling did not look like a man waiting for his bride. He looked like a storm contained within a meticulously tailored charcoal suit. He was a reclusive, ruthless tycoon, known for dismantling companies with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. From a distance, he possessed the unyielding presence of dark steel. He did not shift his weight. He did not turn to whisper to his groomsmen. He had none. He stood entirely alone before the altar, an impenetrable fortress of a man. I began to walk. The organ music swelled, a mournful, echoing dirge that bounced off the vaulted stone ceilings. Every step required a deliberate act of will. My left hand throbbed, where the tight gold band restricted the blood flow in my finger, a constant, pulsing reminder of the lie I was carrying toward the altar. When I finally reached the steps of the sanctuary, the elderly curate, Father Gregory, offered a warm, oblivious smile. I stepped up to stand beside the groom. The moment I was close enough, a distinct scent washed over me, cutting through the heavy church incense. It was the sharp, clean aroma of cedarwood mixed with the cold bite of winter rain. It smelled like deep woods, like isolation. Father Gregory raised his hands to begin the opening rites. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Arthur stepped forward from the front pew. "I do." His voice shook slightly, betraying his guilt, before he quickly retreated to his seat. It was time for the unveiling. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Julian turned to face me. He reached out with large, steady hands. His fingers brushed the edge of the heavy lace. I braced myself for the shout, for the anger, for the moment he would violently throw the veil down and halt the ceremony in a rage of betrayal. Julian lifted the lace over my head, pushing it back so it draped over my shoulders. The cold air of the chapel hit my flushed cheeks. I forced myself to look up, refusing to lower my chin. I met his gaze. His eyes were impossibly dark, like the surface of a frozen lake at midnight. I watched the realization hit him. I saw the microscopic tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he took in my face. He noted the lack of Evelyn's signature charm, the sharp, guarded defiance in my expression, and the slightly ill-fitting bodice of the gown. He knew. Instantly, completely, he knew I was the wrong sister. I waited for the storm to break. But the man carved from frost did not flinch. He did not turn to the priest. He did not expose my father's fraud to the whispering congregation. Instead, his gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to my left hand, where the ill-fitting jewelry sat, trapped against my swollen, red knuckle. Something unreadable flickered in the depths of his eyes. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. "Julian," Father Gregory prompted softly, stepping forward with the heavy parchment vow document and a traditional silver tray. The declarations. Julian did not look at the elderly curate. He did not take his eyes off me. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit coat and withdrew a heavy, silver fountain pen. The congregation shifted in their wooden pews, the rustle of silk and wool echoing in the sudden, stretched silence. This was not part of the ceremony. Father Gregory blinked in confusion as Julian reached out and calmly took the thick parchment from the priest's trembling hands. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Only ours was not drafted in a sterile boardroom. It was executed at the foot of a holy altar. Julian unspooled the cap of his fountain pen. The silence in the chapel grew absolute, thick and suffocating, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic scratch of a steel nib tearing across the expensive paper. He was deliberately, methodically crossing out the printed vows of the traditional sacrament. He drew harsh, dark lines over the words love, honor, and cherish. He wrote something new in the margins, the ink bleeding slightly into the rough texture of the parchment. When he finished, he handed the document back to the bewildered priest, without a single word of explanation. Then, Julian stepped dangerously close to me. He moved into my space, his broad shoulders blocking me entirely from the view of the congregation and my father. The physical proximity was overwhelming. The heat radiating from his chest clashed against the freezing dampness of the stone room. He bowed his head, bringing his mouth, just inches from my ear. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my icy skin, a startling contrast to the absolute terror pooling in my stomach. He did not shout. He did not make a public spectacle. When he spoke, his voice was a low, chilling whisper, meant only for me to hear in the hollow space between us. "Evelyn chose her freedom," Julian murmured, his tone devoid of any warmth, wrapping around me like a heavy iron chain. "And your father chose his greed. You are the collateral, Clara." A shiver racked my spine, not from the cold, but from hearing my actual name on his lips. He had known who I was the second he lifted the veil. "I do not care which Vance daughter stands in this dress," he continued, his breath a phantom touch against my jawline. "But understand this, I am claiming the debt. You belong to my estate, to my house, to my rules, until every cent of your father's ledger is balanced. There is no escape clause for you. Not if you understand." I stood perfectly still. The red mark on my finger throbbed. The smothering weight of my sister's dress felt like a burial shroud. I looked up into his dark, fathomless eyes, searching for an ounce of mercy, a hint of human hesitation. There was none. He was a vault, locked and sealed. But I was not a helpless victim. I was a restorer. I knew how to survive in the dust and the quiet. With a slow, deliberate motion, I gave him a single, shallow nod. Julian's jaw clenched. He stepped back, restoring the physical distance between us, immediately re-erecting the wall of cold steel that separated him from the rest of the world. He turned his face back to the priest, his expression wiped clean of any emotion. "Proceed," the groom commanded quietly. Father Gregory looked down at the altered parchment, his face draining of color as he read the new, handwritten terms of our union. The elderly man swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he looked between the intimidating billionaire and the substitute bride. But the power in the room belonged entirely to the man in the dark suit. The priest cleared his throat, bypassing the crossed-out paragraphs, and rushed straight to the final blessing, sealing a transaction that had absolutely nothing to do with grace and everything to do with quiet, inescapable ruin. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's closed behind us with a resonant thud, instantly cutting off the suffocating whispers of the congregation and the lingering smell of church incense. There was no celebratory rice thrown into the air, no joyous chorus of bells to announce our union, and no smiling family members waiting to embrace the bride. There was only the bitter, freezing downpour of the coastal region and the stark reality of the ink currently drying on a desecrated parchment. I walked beside my new husband beneath the massive black umbrella he held over us. He did not offer his arm, and I did not reach out to take it. We moved as two isolated islands, forced into the same turbulent current, stepping carefully over the muddy puddles that threatened to ruin the thick satin hem of my borrowed gown. A long, sleek black town car waited idling at the curb, its exhaust pluming into the frigid, salt-laced air. The driver, a stoic man in a dark uniform, opened the rear door without uttering a single word of congratulations. I gathered the heavy, wet folds of Evelyn's silk dress and climbed inside, the stiff bridal corset digging mercilessly into my ribs with the physical effort. Julian slid in beside me a moment later, bringing the crisp, unmistakable essence of wet timber and chilled wool into the confined space. The heavy car door clicked shut, sealing us in a private, leather, upholstered vault that felt leagues away from the disaster we had just left behind. The vehicle began to move, smoothly navigating the winding roads away from the chapel and toward the dense, towering grid of the city. The interior was dimly lit by the passing street lamps, the erratic flashes of amber light casting long, shifting shadows across Julian's angular profile. He sat perfectly rigid against the leather seat, his gaze fixed permanently on the violent storm battering the tinted windows. I sat frozen in the opposite corner, my arms wrapped tightly around my torso. The stone chapel had been freezing, but the dampness of the coastal storm had seeped completely through the thin lace of my sleeves during our short walk to the car. I was shivering, a violent, involuntary tremor that rattled my teeth and made the heavy fabric of the dress rustle loudly against the quiet hum of the engine. I tried desperately to suppress it, refusing to show any more physical weakness to the man who now legally owned my family's debts. Julian did not look at me. He did not speak. But as my shoulders gave another uncontrollable shudder, the stoic tycoon finally moved. With a quiet, fluid motion, He unbuttoned his charcoal suit coat. He slipped it off his broad shoulders, the expensive fabric heavy and impeccably tailored, and leaned across the empty space between us. I flinched, instinctively pressing my spine flat against the cold glass of the window, my heart hammering violently in my throat. I expected a reprimand, a harsh, verbal reminder of my place as his collateral, or a demand for gratitude. Instead, the heavy warmth of his coat settled gently over my shivering frame. The heat radiating from the dark wool lining was immediate and profound, enveloping me in the comforting scent of sandalwood and old paper. Julian adjusted the lapels around my neck with a detached, clinical precision, ensuring the fabric covered my damp arms completely to block out the chill. His knuckles briefly brushed against my collarbone, a fleeting, accidental contact that sent a sharp jolt of awareness through my frozen skin. He pulled his hand back immediately, restoring the invisible boundary of steel that defined his existence. He still did not say a word, merely retreating to his corner of the car, in his crisp white dress shirt and dark vest. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, interrupted only by the rhythmic, sweeping squeak of the windshield wipers pushing the rain away. But my shivering was not the only physical torment I was enduring in that quiet car. Beneath the pooling layers of white silk, my feet were in absolute agony. In his panic, Arthur had forced me into Evelyn's bridal slippers, delicate, pointed creations woven from ivory ribbon and stiff satin. My sister had narrow feet meant for dancing. Mine were the practical feet of a textile restorer. The tight satin was cutting deeply into my heels, and the silk ribbons laced up my ankles were restricting my circulation, creating a sharp, burning pain with every microscopic bump in the road. I shifted my weight slightly on this leather seat, letting out a sharp, involuntary hiss of breath as the rigid back of the right shoe dug directly into a fresh, weeping blister. Julian's dark eyes shifted from the window. He looked down at the floorboard, tracing the source of my discomfort hidden beneath the yards of excessive fabric. Then, he did something that completely shattered the terrifying, ruthless image my father had built of him. The powerful billionaire, a man who dismantled corporate empires, with a casual flick of his fountain pen, leaned forward and slipped off the edge of his seat. He lowered himself onto the carpeted floor of the moving car, kneeling awkwardly in the cramped, shadowed space directly in front of me. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I instinctively tried to pull my legs back. "Keep still," Julian commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that left absolutely no room for argument. He reached under the heavy hem of my dress, his large, warm hands, finding my right ankle in the dim light. I stiffened, my internal defensive walls spiking instantly, but his touch was surprisingly clinical and steady. He did not linger, nor did he caress the skin of my calf. He merely located the agonizingly tight knot of the silk ribbon digging into my flesh. With patient, methodical movements, he began to untie the elaborate, restrictive lacing. "They are my sister's shoes," I whispered, feeling a sudden, irrational wave of shame for the borrowed nature of my suffering. "They don't fit. Nothing about today fits." "I noticed," Julian replied quietly, pulling the stubborn ribbon loose and gently slipping the stiff satin shoe off of my foot entirely. The sudden rush of blood back into my heel was a dizzying, overwhelming relief. He set the ruined shoe aside on the floor mat and immediately reached for the left one. As he worked the second tight knot free, his thumb brushed against the angry red welt on my ankle where the ribbon had cut the deepest. I sucked in a sharp breath, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from making a sound. Julian paused, his head bowed, the dark strands of his hair falling slightly over his forehead to obscure his eyes. "I heard you cry. I didn't like it," he murmured softly, his tone completely devoid of the icy corporate authority he had wielded at the altar just an hour ago. He removed the second shoe, leaving my aching feet resting purely on the soft, carpeted floor mats. He remained kneeling for a second longer than necessary, his hands resting lightly on the ivory material, pooling around my shins, the silence hanging heavy between us. Then, he rose, seamlessly returning to his seat as if the deeply intimate act of physical service had never occurred. He buttoned his dark vest, adjusted his silver cufflinks, and looked back out the window into the dark, rain-swept city streets without demanding a single word of thanks. I sat bewildered, drowning in the warmth of his oversized coat, my bare toes curling into the carpet. Beside him on the center console lay the leather folio Father Gregory had handed him before we departed, the official copy of our marriage registry. The edge of the altered parchment was visible, the ink stark against the cream paper. Driven by a sudden, desperate need to understand the exact boundaries of my new cage, I reached out and gently pulled the document toward me. Julian saw the movement in his peripheral vision, but he did not stop me. I opened the folio in my lap. There, beneath the heavy, aggressive lines he had drawn over the traditional vows, was his sharp, angular handwriting. I read the terms that had sealed my fate, expecting to find the rigid language of a prison sentence. The debt of Arthur Vance is hereby absorbed in full by the Sterling estate. The guarantor of this debt is Clara Vance. It was exactly what he had whispered to me at the altar. But it was the sentence written directly beneath it, in slightly smaller, darker ink, that made my pulse stop completely. In exchange for her presence, no further financial, legal, or physical claims shall ever be made against Clara Vance by the Vance family. She is removed from their ledger permanently. I stared at the words, the rough texture of the paper blurring beneath my sudden, unshed tears. It was a transaction, yes. It was a cold, calculated claim of ownership. But as I sat in the quiet safety of his car, I realized the terrifying truth of what Julian Sterling had actually done. He had not just purchased me to punish my father's fraud. He had bought my permanent freedom from Arthur's control. He had deliberately built a wall of wealth and legal steel between me and the toxic family that had commodified me my entire life. Half an hour later, the town car slowed, turning off the slick, rain-washed avenues and descending into the private, subterranean garage of a towering glass high-rise in the heart of the city. We were not heading to his legendary coastal estate yet. This was his urban residence, a sterile, imposing fortress of concrete and steel, perched high above the turbulent, neon-lit streets. As the private elevator carried us upward, my stomach twisted with quiet apprehension. This was a space built for high-altitude isolation, a physical sanctuary designed to keep the chaotic world at bay. It felt like a structural mirror of his own guarded heart. Inside, the penthouse was cavernous, meticulously ordered and deeply quiet. The air smelled of sharp ozone, polished glass, and the faint bitter trace of dark coffee. There were no armies of servants bustling about, no ostentatious displays of gold, and no warm touches of domestic life. There was only the quiet, heavy permanence of slate floors, rich mahogany accents, and severe modern lines. I was led down a long, shadowed hallway to a guest suite that felt vast and uncomfortably pristine. The room featured cold marble floors, sharp minimalist furniture, and a massive floor-to-ceiling window that looked directly out over the sprawling rain-swept city skyline. My modest canvas bag, containing the only practical clothes I owned, had been retrieved from the vestry and now sat looking pitifully small at the foot of an enormous, perfectly made bed. I was just beginning to unfasten the exhausting, complicated corset of the wedding dress. My fingers, numb and clumsy, when a sharp, jarring noise shattered the peace of the quiet room. It was the telephone. A heavy, antique brass rotary phone sat completely out of place on the sleek, modern glass writing desk near the window. It was a strange anachronism in this clinical environment, and it rang with a shrill, mechanical urgency that felt entirely alien and invasive. I hesitated, my stomach tightening into a painful knot. Very few people knew I was here in the city. Very few people even knew the true identity of Julian Sterling's replacement bride yet. I walked slowly to the desk, the cumbersome train dragging behind me, and lifted the brass receiver to my ear. "Hello? Clara." My father's voice crackled through the phone line, vibrating with a frantic, desperate energy that instantly transported me back to the freezing flagstones of the chapel vestry. "Father," I said softly, my grip tightening on the heavy handset until my knuckles turned white. "Listen to me carefully," Arthur hissed, dropping any pretense of paternal concern or relief that I had arrived safely. "The creditors called my office 20 minutes ago. Sterling hasn't wired the funds yet. The accounts are still frozen." "Did he give you the estate routing numbers?" "You need to transfer $50,000 to the company's holding account immediately, Clara, or we lose the ships." A cold, heavy stone dropped in my chest, settling deep in my stomach. Even now, even after he had literally forced my dead mother's ring onto my bruised finger, and sold me to a terrifying stranger to save his own skin. I was nothing more than a functional extension of his greed. He did not ask if I was safe. He did not ask how the implacable magnate was treating me behind closed doors. He only wanted the blood money. "I am not doing that," I whispered, my strum flailing slightly, but laced with a sudden rigid defiance I didn't know I possessed. "Julian absorbed the debt, father. The legalities are being processed. I am not stealing from my husband on my wedding day to float your company's margin." "Stealing?" Arthur scoffed loudly, the sound harsh and metallic through the earpiece. "You are his wife. What is his is yours. Evelyn would have had a blank check in her purse by now. Do what you are told, Clara, or I will come to that apartment myself and what?" The new voice did not come from the telephone receiver. It came from the open doorway of my bedroom. I spun around, my heart leaping violently into my throat. Julian stood in the archway, leaning casually against the stark white doorframe. He had removed his suit coat and vest, his crisp white sleeves rolled up neatly to his forearms, revealing the taut muscles beneath. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on me, his expression an unreadable mask of glacial indifference. I had no idea how long he had been standing there, listening to the transactional reality of my bloodline. I panicked, slamming the heavy brass receiver down onto the cradle, cutting my father off mid-threat. The silence rushed back into the room, thick and ringing in my ears against the muted sound of the city rain beating against the glass. Julian pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly into the room. He moved like a predator, perfectly comfortable in his own territory, his deliberate footsteps making absolutely no sound on the polished floors. My pulse hammered wildly against my ribs. This was the moment. This was where the ruthless corporate raider would realize he had married a massive liability, a parasite, permanently tied to a family of leeches. He stopped less than 2 feet away from me, the familiar trace of forest timber and the faint, bitter aroma of dark coffee washed over me, grounding me in the sudden proximity. I lifted my chin, bracing myself for the verbal reprimand, holding on to my quiet dignity like a physical shield. I would not apologize for Arthur's greed. I would not shrink away and beg for forgiveness. "Julian, I did not ask him to call," I said quietly, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level, despite the shaking of my hands. "I will not ask you for anything. You do not have to worry about your accounts." Julian stared down at me. He studied my face in the dim light, mapping the guarded defiance in my eyes, the slight, involuntary tremble in my jaw, and my absolute refusal to play the helpless, weeping victim. He reached slowly into his pocket. I flinched slightly, expecting him to produce a cell phone to call his security detail, or perhaps the torn pieces of our contract to throw in my face. Instead, he withdrew a single heavy object. He reached out, taking my right hand. His grip was firm but surprisingly gentle as he turned my palm upward. He placed a large antique brass key into the center of my hand. The metal was heavy and shockingly cold, deeply etched with a series of complex numbers. With slow, deliberate pressure, Julian folded my trembling fingers over the key, closing my hand into a tight fist and holding it securely within his own warm grasp. "This," Julian murmured softly, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the air in the room feel impossibly thin, "is the key to the vault in my private study down the hall. It holds the physical ledgers, the bearer bonds, and the emergency liquid cash reserves for my urban accounts." I stared at him in profound, paralyzing shock, the cold brass biting into the soft skin of my palm. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because your father sees you as a currency," Julian replied, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the quiet space between us. "He believes you are merely an extension of his greed. He thinks you will siphon my wealth because he trained you to survive on his scraps." He took a half-step closer, his thumb slowly brushing over the injured knuckles of my left hand, where the suffocating band still sat as a marker of my trauma. "Say you're not her," Julian whispered, the command laced with an unexpected, raw vulnerability that cracked his stoic armor for just a fraction of a second. "Say you are not the woman your father expects you to be." "I am not," I breathed, my voice barely a rustle of sound in the modern room. "Then prove it," he said quietly, slowly releasing my hand, but leaving the heavy brass key burning in my grip. I am giving you the power to ruin me, Clara. You can empty that vault tonight and run back to Arthur. Or you can stay here and realize that I do not lock my doors against you." He stepped back, instantly re-erecting the emotional, steely barrier that kept him safe from the world. He turned and walked toward the dark hallway, his posture rigid, tall, and uncompromising. "Dinner is at 7, he stated, pausing at the threshold without looking back. "Wear whatever you like. But take off your sister's dress. It doesn't suit you." Julian disappeared into the dark corridor, leaving me standing entirely alone in the center of the vast, sterile room. The city storm continued to rage relentlessly against the thick glass of the window, but inside my chest, the air was perfectly, wonderfully still. I slowly opened my fist, staring down at the heavy brass key resting against my skin. It was not a tool for theft. It was a test, a silent, profound challenge of character from a man who used wealth as a weapon, yet had just willingly handed me the blade. 2 weeks after the suffocated, clinical quiet of the city penthouse, the world shifted from polished glass and steel to ancient, weathered stone and churning black water. We relocated to Julian's primary sanctuary, a massive, secluded manor perched dangerously close to the jagged, rain-battered cliffs of the Pacific Northwest. The drive had been a steady descent into absolute isolation. The winding coastal roads flanked by towering, ancient redwoods that effectively wallowed the pale afternoon light. When the estate finally emerged from the heavy coastal fog, it did not look like a home meant for a newlywed couple. It looked like a fortress. The air here was constantly thick with the aggressive scent of salt, wet pine needles, and centuries of undisturbed dust. The house was a sprawling labyrinth of dark mahogany panels, cavernous stone fireplaces that were rarely lit, and endless, damp libraries filled with forgotten, leather-bound books. It was a physical manifestation of my husband's heavily guarded mind, imposing, chillingly quiet, and designed explicitly to keep the chaotic, transactional world outside its heavy iron gates. We lived in entirely separate wings of the massive estate, navigating the sprawling, shadowed corridors like two solitary ghosts, who merely happened to haunt the same historical footprint. But within that profound, echoing silence, a new, unspoken language began to take root between us. Every evening, just as the seaside tempest reached its violent, howling peak against the historic panes, I would find a small, tarnished silver tray left carefully on the floor, outside my heavy oak bedroom door. I never heard his heavy footsteps approach. I never caught the stoic tycoon in the act of leaving it. On the polished silver surface sat a single, hand-carved cedarwood mug filled to the brim with steaming hot chamomile tea, the water infused with a faint trace of fresh peppermint. There was never a note attached to the handle, never a verbal demand for my presence in his wing, and absolutely no expectation of gratitude. He simply provided a quiet, reliable warmth in the absolute coldest part of the night. A genuine refuge does not announce itself. It simply draws you in without a whisper. I would carry the sturdy wooden mug to the velvet cushion of my window seat, letting the soothing heat seep deeply into my perpetually cold, calloused palms. I would sit for hours, sipping the fragrant brew and watching the relentless gray rain blur the violent coastline into a soft, watercolor painting. In those quiet, intensely solitary moments, surrounded by the scent of steeped flowers and wet timber, an unfamiliar, terrifying sense of emotional safety began to slowly bloom in the center of my chest. Julian did not want to control me. He only wanted to ensure I did not freeze in the dark. The fragile, carefully constructed piece of our silent routine was violently shattered on the 14th day, when the outside world finally demanded entry to the fortress. Julian was contractually obligated to host a formal dinner for his primary corporate investors and the elite families of the coastal society. It was to be my very first public appearance as his wife, the grand, unavoidable unveiling of the stand-in bride to a room full of people who viewed human beings as nothing more than assets and liabilities. That morning, amidst the gray light filtering through the storm, I found a flat, midnight blue velvet box resting squarely on the center of my dressing table. Inside lay a heavy, antique pearl necklace. It was not a delicate, modern piece of jewelry meant to lightly dazzle a crowd. The pearls were large, slightly irregular in their natural shape, and profoundly heavy, with generational history. They felt less like an aesthetic accessory, and much more like a physical anchor, a weight meant to ground me in the reality of my new, permanent position. I fastened the cool, intricate silver clasp at the nape of my neck, staring closely at my reflection in the dim vanity mirror. The pearls rested perfectly against my collarbone, a silent, beautiful armor provided by a man who communicated his protection strictly through the things he gave and the things he withheld. By 8 o'clock, the manor's formal dining room was ablaze with the harsh light of tiered crystal chandeliers. The guests were sharks wrapped in expensive silk and tailored wool, their sharp eyes tracking my movements with predatory amusement. I stood rigidly at the far end of the long mahogany table, separated from my husband by a vast sea of silver cloches, taper candles, and suffocating floral essences. The air was thick with the aroma of heavy French perfumes and the metallic tang of poured vintage wine. I kept my posture rigidly straight, focusing the entirety of my attention on the rough, starchy texture of the heavy white linen napkin draped across my lap, utterly refusing to let the coastal elite see me bleed under their scrutiny. The woman seated to my immediate left, the diamond-draped wife of a prominent shipping magnate who had long done business with my father, swirled the dark red liquid in her crystal glass. She leaned toward me, her lips curling into a conspiratorial, venomous smile that did not reach her cold eyes. "It must be quite a heavy daily burden for you, Clara," she murmured, her tone dripping with a feigned, theatrical sympathy that was perfectly calibrated to carry to the surrounding guests. Knowing this grand, historical house, and this entire evening was meticulously prepared for Evelyn. We were all so terribly shocked when Arthur announced the sudden substitution at the altar. "You wear her leftover fortune bravely, darling, considering everyone in this room knows you were never the intended prize." I did not shrink back into my solid oak chair. I did not flush with embarrassment or lower my gaze to my plate. Slowly, deliberately, I carefully set my heavy silver fork down on the pristine white tablecloth, the metal making a soft, definitive click against the porcelain plate. But before I could form a quiet, dignified response to protect my own pride, a sharp, piercing sound violently cut through the low, buzzing hum of the dining room. Ping. Julian had calmly picked up his silver soup spoon and struck the delicate rim of his crystal wine glass. The noise was not aggressively loud, but it possessed a dense, commanding frequency that instantly paralyzed the entire length of the table. The mocking whispers died instantly in the throats of the elite. The clinking of silverware ceased completely. Every single eye in the vast room snapped toward the head of the table. Julian leaned back slowly in his high-backed leather chair, the dark, impeccable lines of his tailored suit contrasting sharply with the pale stone of the fireplace behind him. His fathomless, midnight eyes were fixed entirely on the woman who had dared to mock me. "You are deeply, fundamentally mistaken," my husband stated, his voice a low, even rumble that carried effortlessly across the silent expanse of the dining room. This house was never prepared for Evelyn. Evelyn Vance was a draft, a chaotic, unreliable, and entirely superficial liability that Arthur Vance desperately attempted to package and sell to my firm. He held the entire room captive with his absolute, terrifying stillness, methodically dismantling my sister's pristine social reputation with cold, factual precision. No one dared to take a breath. "I was the one who altered the vows at the altar," Julian continued, his gaze slowly panning across the faces of his silent investors, challenging anyone to contradict him. I deliberately crossed out the standard terms the moment the veil was lifted, because I realized in that exact second that the only daughter with the intellect, the quiet resilience, and the sheer dignity to carry the sterling name was already standing in front of me. Clara was never a substitute. She was the immediate correction of a massive, unacceptable error. The absolute silence that followed his words was a heavy vacuum that completely sucked the oxygen from the room. It had teeth aggressively chewing through the unfounded arrogance of every guest seated at our table. Julian did not wait for the woman's stammered apology. He stood up, abandoning his untouched meal, and walked with slow, unhurried steps down the entire length of the dining room until he reached my chair. He did not ask me to stand. He simply reached down beneath the edge of the tablecloth and found my trembling hand. his calloused fingers wrapped firmly around mine, his thumb pressing gently over the bruised knuckle, where the inherited shackle still sat as a marker of my past. He gave my hand a heavy, grounding squeeze, sending a wave of raw heat through my frozen veins. I looked up. The icy facade was completely absent from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, fierce devotion that stole the breath straight from my lungs. "Shall we retire to the study, my wife?" he asked softly, the term completely devoid of ownership, dripping instead with profound, chosen respect. The profound peace of that public vindication lasted exactly 3 days. By the end of the week, the lingering coastal storm had intensified into a raging, violent gale, throwing thick sheets of freezing gray rain against the framed windows of the manor's grand foyer. The wind howled through the ancient stone chimneys, vibrating the floorboards beneath my feet. I was sitting quietly in the adjacent library, entirely absorbed in carefully mending a frayed, delicate section of a historical silk tapestry. The fragile thread I was working with had snapped, leaving me with a frayed end that required a finer tool to manage. I set my needle down on the scarred wooden table and walked over to Julian's massive, antique mahogany desk, sliding open the heavy brass-handled drawers in search of a spare spool of mending silk or a sharper pair of shears. In the deep-shadowed bottom drawer, my fingers brushed against worn leather. It was not a sterile corporate file. I pulled it into the dim light of the library. My breath stalled completely in my throat. It was the maternal ledger, my mother's diary. My hands shook violently as I traced my fingertips over the familiar, weathered cover, opening it to find her meticulous sketches of old lace and exact notes on thread tension. Tucked securely between the aged pages was a stark, modern document bearing Julian's sharp, undeniable signature. It was a formal transfer of corporate debt. As my eyes scanned the financial terms, the date at the top of the page made the room spin. Julian had not purchased my father's crushing obligations as part of Evelyn's dowry negotiation. He had bought the Vance family debts years ago. Attached to the corner of the contract was a small ledger slip, penned in Julian's dark ink. The note detailed a charity gala from 3 years prior, specifically documenting my name and my quiet, unyielding refusal to engage in my father's desperate pleading. He had observed my silent dignity when I thought I was entirely invisible. He had orchestrated the financial takeover specifically to shield me, not my sister, long before the chaotic catastrophe of our wedding day. I stood frozen, the heavy parchment trembling in my hands. The realization washed over me like a warm tide, utterly dismantling the last remnants of my defensive armor. Julian had never viewed me as a convenient substitute. He had been quietly clearing a safe path for me for years. But before I could fully absorb the monumental weight of his silent protection, the heavy groaning of the front oak doors echoed sharply through the quiet corridors. An instant later, a sharp, cloying scent violently invaded the natural sanctuary of the house. It was the unmistakable, overpowering aroma of sweet jasmine perfume, completely and aggressively clashing with the comforting, natural blend of timber, wood smoke, and old paper that belonged exclusively to Julian. I slowly set the maternal ledger down on the scarred wooden desk and walked deliberately toward the grand entryway, my stomach twisting into a cold, heavy knot of anticipation. I stepped past the stone archway and found my nightmare standing dripping wet on the ancient slate floor. Evelyn had returned. My sister stood in the center of the foyer, her expensive, beige designer coat soaked completely through with the freezing coastal rain. Her perfect theatrical makeup was slightly smeared beneath her wide eyes, but her posture remained entirely arrogant, entitled, and unyielding. Standing a half step behind her in the shadows was Arthur, looking intensely nervous but stubbornly, pathetically hopeful, clutching a worn leather briefcase to his damp chest, like a physical shield against the reality of his choices. The runaway bride spotted me, standing quietly on the lower steps of the grand staircase. She did not look at me with an ounce of genuine guilt, nor did she offer a single, fractured word of apology for the financial devastation and emotional ruin she had callously abandoned me to face alone in the freezing vestry. She looked at me exactly as she always had, like a quiet, invisible maid who had simply been keeping her rightful seat warm while she was away. "You can pack your little canvas bags now, Clara." my sister announced, her shrill, confident voice echoing harshly against the cold, unforgiving stone walls. The little adventure is officially over. I realized the transient life was a mistake, and Father has already spoken to the estate lawyers this morning. We can easily amend the corporate filings by Monday to reflect the original agreement. I am ready to take my proper place as Mrs. Sterling. Arthur stepped forward from the damp shadows of the heavy doorway, wringing his pale, shaking hands together. "It is truly for the best, Clara," the desperate man pleaded, though his terrified eyes constantly darted toward the dark, silent hallways, deathly afraid of Julian's sudden appearance. "You were always just a temporary placeholder until your sister came to her senses and returned. Julian is a ruthless businessman. He will obviously want the flawless, socially acceptable bride he originally negotiated the merger for. Take off those estate pearls, sweetheart. They belong to the true lady of the house." Evelyn did not wait for my quiet consent, my tears, or my expected surrender. Driven by a lifetime of absolute, unquestioned entitlement, she marched aggressively across the wet slate floor, closing the physical distance between us with terrifying speed. She reached her hand out, her perfectly manicured fingers curving slightly like talons, aiming directly for the heavy, antique pearl necklace resting securely against my collarbone. She fully expected me to lower my chin, to shrink back silently into the shadows of the staircase, and to obediently hand over the only physical armor I possessed. I did not step back, I did not flinch, and I did not lower my eyes. As her hand darted forward to physically strip me of my dignity a second time, my own arm shot up in a blur of defensive instinct. I caught Evelyn's wrist mid-air, a mere 2 inches away from my throat. My grip was not born of violent malice, but it was forged from years of quiet, meticulous, punishing labor, pulling heavy canvas threads, lifting massive antique ledgers, and surviving the crushing, daily weight of their constant neglect. I held her delicate, bird-like wrist in a vice of absolute, unyielding stillness. Evelyn gasped aloud, a sharp, ugly sound of genuine, paralyzing shock at the unexpected physical resistance. She tried to yank her arm back, but I did not let go. I stared deeply into my older sister's beautiful, entirely hollow face, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of quiet pity entirely replace the 2 decades of deep-seated intimidation I had harbored. I saw the absolute desperation hiding just beneath her expensive perfume. She had run away to find freedom, only to realize she possessed absolutely no skills to survive a world that did not hand her everything on a silver platter. I slowly, deliberately pushed her hand firmly away from my chest, forcing her arm to drop completely uselessly to her side. "I am not your placeholder," I said softly, my voice perfectly level, stripping the charged, humid air of the foyer of any melodramatic hysteria. "And I am not our father's collateral, to be traded back and forth across a ledger when it suddenly suits your profound boredom." I calmly smoothed the fabric of my simple wool dress, feeling the heavy, historical pearls resting warm and secure against my own skin. I looked past my stunned sister to the pale, trembling man who had forced a ring onto my bruised finger and sold me to the storm. "I am the guarantor of the debt," I reminded them quietly, echoing the exact, permanent terms Julian had carved into the parchment with his fountain pen. "And this is my house." The absolute, unyielding silence in the foyer was so profound that I could hear the frantic, uneven rhythm of my sister's breathing. Evelyn stood entirely frozen on the damp slate, her beautiful, hollow eyes wide, with a terror she had never been forced to experience. For her entire life, she had navigated the world, armed with nothing but her effortless charm, and the destructive certainty that someone else would always pay the toll for her recklessness. But as she stared at my raised chin, at the immovable grip I maintained on the air between us, the fundamental laws of her universe collapsed. I released her wrist. The physical contact broke, but the heavy psychological boundary I had just drawn remained permanently suspended in the freezing coastal air. "Clara, you are not thinking clearly," Arthur stammered, his voice thin and reedy, over the relentless howling of the storm outside. The desperate man took a hesitant half-step forward, clutching his worn briefcase like a life preserver. "You are acting out of spite. Julian is a man who demands perfection. When he discovers that Evelyn has returned, that the original, flawless asset is available again, He will cast you out into the rain without a single cent. Do not make this harder than it has to be. He does not have to discover anything. A low, gravelly voice echoed through the cavernous space. The temperature in the grand entryway plummeted instantly. I did not need to turn around to know who had spoken. The sharp, immaculate aura of mountain pine and cold winter air rolled down the grand staircase, entirely consuming the cloying, superficial aroma of sweet jasmine perfume that Evelyn had dragged into the house. Julian descended the heavy stone steps with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator entirely at peace in his own territory. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his tie loosened just enough to betray the late hour, but his posture was a fortress of unyielding steel. He did not look at me with anger or disappointment. His pitch-black gaze bypassed my defensive stance entirely and locked directly onto the two intruders shivering on his foyer floor. Evelyn instinctively straightened her ruined designer coat, offering a trembling, highly practiced smile. "Julian," she breathed, her dripping with a calculated, breathy vulnerability. It was a terrible, chaotic misunderstanding. I was overwhelmed. The pressure of the merger, the expectations. I panicked. But I am here now. I have returned to fulfill our arrangement. Julian reached the bottom of the staircase. He did not cross the expanse of the slate floor to greet her. He simply stopped beside me, his broad shoulder a mere inch from my own, radiating a profound, silent heat that instantly steadied my racing pulse. "There is no arrangement with you," my husband stated, his tone completely devoid of malice, which somehow made the absolute finality of his words even more terrifying. "And there was no misunderstanding. I knew exactly what time you climbed out of the vestry window at St. Jude's." Arthur's face drained of the last remaining drops of color. You knew. My security detail was stationed at the perimeter of the chapel grounds 3 hours before the ceremony. Julian continued with clinical, devastating precision. "They watched your eldest daughter pack a single leather travel bag. They watched her hail a cab bound for the city train station. I was informed of her departure before I even put on my suit jacket." My heart stalled in my chest. I turned to look at the stoic tycoon standing beside me, my mind racing to comprehend the sheer scale of the revelation. He had known Evelyn was gone. He had known before he walked down the aisle, before Arthur had forced the heavy gold ring onto my bruised knuckle in a blind panic. "Then why didn't you stop the wedding?" Evelyn demanded, her carefully constructed mask of elegant cracking to reveal the petulant, confused child beneath. "Why did you let my father put her in my dress?" Julian did not immediately answer. Instead, he reached out and gently took my left hand. His long, calloused fingers traced the faint, fading red mark on my knuckle, where my mother's heirloom band still sat. It was a microscopic, deeply intimate gesture of care performed in the center of a battlefield. Then he turned his cold gaze back to my father. "Because I required the legal transfer of your family's debt to execute my claim." Julian explained softly, every word striking the air like the tolling of an execution bell. "And because I have spent the last 3 years searching for the woman who actually possesses the intellect and the dignity to stand beside me. Evelyn was merely the noisy distraction I allowed you to leverage until I could secure the true asset." With his free hand, Julian reached inside the inner breast pocket of his dark suit coat. He did not pull out a legal injunction or a corporate checkbook. He withdrew a small, incredibly dusty, leather-bound ledger book. It was not the maternal diary I had found in his desk earlier that day. This volume was different, older, and bound in faded green canvas. He tossed it casually onto the heavy mahogany console table near the door. The book landed with a heavy, definitive thud, sending a small cloud of ancient dust dancing into the amber light of the chandelier. 5 years ago, the Sterling estate commissioned the restoration of a fragile, 19th-century silk tapestry, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, hypnotic register. It was a piece belonging to my late grandmother. 3 prominent restoration firms declared it ruined beyond any hope of salvage. But it was returned to me 6 months later, flawlessly repaired. Inside the shipping crate was this logbook. I stared at the faded green canvas cover, my breath hitching sharply in my throat. I remembered that project. It had been one of the most punishing, delicate assignments of my early career, taking me countless solitary hours in the freezing back room of my father's warehouse to mend the invisible broken threads. Julian stepped forward and flipped the heavy cover open. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten notes regarding thread tension, historical dye matching, and the structural integrity of ancient silk. I read these margins, the powerful man murmured, looking down at the ink. The artisan wrote, "The warp threads are fragile. They require immense patience, not force. You cannot demand strength from something you have neglected. You must support it in the silence, until it can hold its own weight." She did not leave a business card. She only signed it with her initials, utilizing a very specific, sharp loop on the letter C. He turned the page, revealing a folded piece of modern, cream-colored parchment tucked inside. It was a direct photocopy of the parish registry from the morning of our wedding. When I lifted the veil at the altar, I recognized her eyes from a charity gala she had attended in the shadows. Julian confessed quietly, finally looking away from the intruders to hold my gaze entirely. But when she signed the marriage registry with a trembling hand, I recognized the ink. I recognized the mind that had respected my family's history when no one else would. He closed the dusty volume. The sound was final, like a heavy vault door, sliding shut on Arthur Vance's entire world. "You did not trick me into taking your forgotten daughter, Arthur," Julian stated, his tone dropping to a whisper of absolute, chilling authority. "I absorbed your pathetic, mismanaged debts specifically to build a wall of steel between Clara and your endless greed. The transaction is complete. The ledger is permanently balanced. You will leave my house now, and if you or your runaway bride ever attempt to contact my wife again, I will unfreeze those accounts, and I will personally dismantle your shipping company." Down to the last wooden plank, there was no room for negotiation. There was no space for Evelyn to weep or Arthur to plead. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of Julian's intellect and his profound, silent devotion had entirely suffocated their manipulative oxygen. My father looked at the faded green logbook, then at the heavy antique pearls resting securely against my collarbone. He finally understood that he had never possessed any power in this dynamic at all. Defeated, Arthur bowed his head, grasping Evelyn's damp sleeve, and pulled his protesting, shattered, golden child back out into the relentless coastal storm. The heavy oak doors groaned shut, sealing out the wind and plunging the grand foyer back into a deep, ringing silence. I stood paralyzed on the slate floor, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the man of winter stone, the ruthless tycoon, who had just revealed a depth of patience and quiet reverence that completely unmoored me. He had not bought me to punish a lie. He had orchestrated an empire's worth of leverage merely to give me a safe place to land. "You kept the logbook," I whispered, the words trembling as they left my lips. "I kept everything that proved you existed." Julian replied softly. He did not push for an emotional breakdown. He did not demand a grand declaration of love or gratitude. Instead, he simply offered his arm. "The foyer is too cold, Clara. Come with me to the study. We have one final piece of business to conclude tonight." I placed my hand lightly in the crook of his arm, letting his solid, steady warmth guide me, away from the drafty entryway and deep into the heart of the ancient manor. The private study was a small, fiercely protected sanctuary. It smelled heavily of old paper, burning pine wood, and safety. A large fire roared in the cavernous stone hearth, casting dancing, golden shadows across the rows of leather-bound books, and the worn Persian rug. The storm battered the tall glass windows. But inside this room, the world was entirely untouchable. Julian guided me toward a pair of deep leather wingback chairs arranged before the fire. Resting on the small wooden table between them was the familiar, tarnished silver tray. Atop it sat two hand-carved cedarwood mugs, steam rising softly into the dim light, carrying the deeply comforting scent of chamomile and fresh peppermint. But there was something else on the tray tonight. Lying flat beneath the mugs was the heavy, cream-colored parchment from the chapel, the altered wedding vows, the document that legally bound me to his estate as debt collateral. Julian released my arm and walked to his massive mahogany desk. He picked up a long, wooden matchstick. "That contract was necessary to sever your father's legal hold over your future," Julian murmured, walking back to the hearth. He stood beside the roaring fire, the dancing orange light softening the harsh, angular lines of his face. He looked down at the parchment resting on the silver tray. It was a shield forged in a crisis. But a shield is still a barrier, Clara, and I do not want any barriers left between us. He struck the match against the stone fireplace. The sudden flare of bright sulfur hissed in the quiet room. Julian picked up the heavy parchment. He did not hesitate, nor did he look away as he held the bottom edge of the document to the open flame. The fire caught instantly, chewing eagerly through the thick, expensive paper. I watched in absolute, silent awe as the harsh, handwritten words, collateral, debt, transaction, curled into black, glowing ash, floating upward into the dark child draft. When the flame neared his calloused fingers, Julian dropped the burning remnants onto the stone hearth, letting the last of my father's toxic legacy turn to completely harmless dust. He turned back to me, stepping into my physical space. His dark eyes were stripped entirely of their corporate armor, revealing a raw, beautiful vulnerability that made my breath catch. He reached out, his soot-stained fingers hovering just an inch from my cheek. "Tell me to stop," Julian whispered, his voice incredibly rough, a quiet plea for permission in a world where he had always taken what he wanted. "Tell me to rebuild the wall, and I will." I did not step back. I did not shrink away. I lifted my own trembling hand and closed the final inch of distance, pressing my palm flat against his warm, strong chest. I could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath the crisp linen of his shirt. "No," I answered softly, a single word that carried the entire weight of my healed soul. Julian closed his eyes, a long, ragged exhale escaping his lips, as if he had been holding his breath since the moment he lifted my veil at the altar. He gently cupped my face, his thumb carefully wiping a stray fleck of black soot from my jawline. The touch was achingly tender, a silent vow far more profound than any words ever spoken in a crowded church. "Write the life you want," my husband murmured against my forehead, resting his weight against me in a gesture of total, humbled surrender. "I'll meet you there." I leaned into his embrace, wrapping my arms around his waist, burying my face in the comforting scent of his tailored collar. The rain continued to beat against the heavy glass, but the sound no longer felt isolating. It felt like a boundary line, safely keeping the transactional world outside where it belonged. I had walked into a chapel expecting to be buried under the weight of an inherited debt, but I had walked out with a sanctuary. We eventually separated, just enough to reach for the silver tray. Julian handed me the heavy wooden mug. The ceramic was incredibly warm against my calloused palms. We sat together in the deep leather chairs, watching the fire slowly consume the last remaining embers of the past. No grand music played. No dramatic declarations echoed off the stone walls. There was only the quiet clinking of ceramic, the crackle of the hearth, and the absolute certainty of mutual respect. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. And I finally understood that home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If this journey of silent healing brought you a sense of peace tonight, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Stay safe in the quiet, and we will meet you in the next chapter.